Okay. So thanks everyone for coming today to the CAPER seminar. Today's seminar will be delivered by Associate Professor Deirdre Howard-Wagner. She'll be presenting on work done as part of a very large team. I won't go through and introduce the team, as I understand Deirdre will do that as part of her presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the lands of all the people we're meeting on here today. Most of the people in this room I can see are here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, where CAPER and the ANU is based. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of that land, elders past and present, and the ongoing battles for sovereignty of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. Deirdre's presentation today is titled The Indigenous Service Market, Conflicting Ontological Ways of Seeing Urban First Nations Organisation in the Era of New Public Management. I won't give Deirdre's very long and illustrious biography. I'll let her introduce herself, and as time is brief, I'll hand over to you now, Deirdre. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. That should have been a brief bio rather than taking the whole thing off my webpage. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen in terms of the presentation. Hopefully you can see that. Is that okay with everyone? Okay, so the presentation that I'm giving today, so I too would like to acknowledge the Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples on whose land we're meeting today, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the partner organisations that I'm collaborating with, and that Janet Hunt and Karen Soldatic are collaborating with, and Morgan Harrington. And they are the Buddha Carbon Aboriginal Corporation, Murrumbidgee, both of those organisations are Western Sydney. The First Peoples Disability Network, which is in Redfern or Sydney. The Glen, which is a Aboriginal drug and alcohol rehabilitation centre up on the Central Coast in New South Wales, and the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence, and the Jillaree Aboriginal Justice Corporation in Canberra. And so the names here on my screen, June Riemer, Jack Gibson, John Leha, Chris Mason, Deb Evans, are all representatives of those organisations on the research project that we're working on. And to give you a visual, this is the research core research team, less Murrumbidgee and Morgan. So, but you can see Morgan's face here, who's present today. And the overarching project is reconfiguring new public management, and it's looking at new public management, Indigenous organisations and Indigenous rights in the in urban context of New South Wales. And so it's a 3-year ARC discovery project which finishes on the 31st of December this year. And it has been very much a partnership, a collaborative partnership between the 4 researchers and the organisations that we're partnering with. So all our decisions are made as a collaborative group, even down to, you know, administrative decisions that we make as well. So what I'm talking to you about today is just one aspect of the project. So we're at the stage of now producing a body of work, and so this is a paper that we've recently submitted to the International Indigenous Policy Journal. And next week we have a workshop. We're presenting our an overarching presentation of the findings of the research, and our partner organisations are all presenting the case studies that we've done. So we've done multi-sided organisational case studies with our partner organisations, and Karen, Janet and I were presenting an overarching discussion about the research in terms of the focus discussion circles that we've had and the surveys. And then in the week after that, I'll be coming back and presenting one of the other papers to this forum relating to some of the other survey data that we have. So this paper itself pulls out particular survey data, and it's really about one of the themes that we were looking at right from the onset of the research was the idea of what is the function or the societal function of urban First Nations organisations in New South Wales, and that was one of our aims within the DP project, the DP submission application, and it's been one of our overarching focuses of our whole project. And one of the other aims is to look at the way that new public management itself is impacting on organisations. So we did a survey, and that survey results were divided into two components. So this is one component, which is the distinctive societal function of First Nations organisations. So I'm not going to go into the background of the paper, so that sort of front end around how policies changed, what is an era of new public management, except to say that, to say that, it's about seeing urban First Nations organisations as service providers in the era of new public management, and that's sort of the ontological lens at which the state looks at or sees First Nations organisations. So we're sort of reversing the ontological lens, taking sort of Walter and Anderson's approach, and through our survey, and the survey's aims are to sort of look at what types of organisational artefacts urban First Nations or peoples construct, and what is the distinctive societal function of urban First Nations organisations. So I'm going to focus on the findings of the survey. And so what I want to do is just give you a bit of a background on the survey itself. In terms of, so it was an iterative research design which entailed 3 face-to-face First Nations reference group meetings where we designed the survey from the onset in collaboration with our First Nation organisation partners. And so on 2 occasions the research team was joined by representatives from 3 additional First Nations organisations from the Greater Sydney region for a First Nations discussion circle, and that was also around the survey design. So that was really about the experiences of organisations, and then to take that sort of those experiences and trying to develop those into some sort of close-ended questions and open-ended questions to see whether those experiences, how widespread those experiences were in terms of the aims and roles and purposes of urban First Nations organisations, why organisations were established, what best described the development agendas of those organisations when they were established, what were the original founding objectives of these organisations, what they think their organisation's social purpose was, and what self-determination means in the context of their organisations as First Nations organisations. And that's the data that I want to focus on in this presentation. So a lot of the indicators that we developed within the survey were developed by our First Nations partners based on their experiences, and we were testing the prevalence of those experiences and as those indicators that they had come up with. But the survey was very much a collaborative process in terms of its design. So in terms of, I'll just go into a little bit more detail too. Once the survey was finalised, we emailed a link to organisations of the survey in SurveyMonkey, and we sent it to all identifiable First Nations organisations incorporated at the state or federal level in 35 significant urban areas in New South Wales, as defined by the Australian Bureau of Statistics 2016, instead of randomly selecting a representative sample of urban First Nations organisations, we also included Queanbeyan because although it's part of the Australian Capital Territory significant urban area, it is in New South Wales. And there were 474 urban First Nations organisations from those 35 significant urban areas in New South Wales that we sent that survey out to via email links that we got through the public domain. And 52 of the 474 organisations participated in the survey, which is an 11% response rate. 51 organisations completed all questions on the role of urban First Nations organisations, but only 33 survey respondents completed the whole survey. The lower completion rate compared to response rate did not fit with the normal parameters of starting but not completing a survey. So in the section on the distinctive role of urban First Nations organisations, some respondents chose to provide qualitative other answers rather than one of the predefined quantitative options. So what we found was that some of our questions in our survey were quantitative questions and some were qualitative. So some would opt in for the qualitative component and not opt in for the quantitative component. So in the section examining the effects of new public management, urban First Nations organisations, which is not the subject of this presentation, 33 respondents completed all 35 questions. And even within that, we had a number of questions on the effects of new public management contained several Likert scales. Only 28 of those organisations compared to, 51 organisations completed all of those questions. So we had a sort of an opt-in, opt-out type of response rate. And so it wasn't that we could say that, we could say that 51 organisations completed the survey by looking at the actual response rates because of the way that they opted in and opted out. They still continued to complete the survey. Consideration of individual responses suggests that some may have felt that certain questions did not apply to their organisation, or some gave detailed qualitative answers that answered later questions, which could potentially account for why they skipped questions, but this cannot be verified. But that just gives you a bit of an insight into the response rate and sort of, the validity of the survey itself. The 51 survey respondents represented well a sample of urban First Nations organisations in New South Wales. They are a small subset group that proportionally reflect the different characteristics exemplified in the target population. So while it was only an 11% response rate, it was a representative sample across nearly all significant urban areas within New South Wales. And the release of the survey coincided with the nationwide COVID-19 lockdown. So even so, our partners anticipated a low response rate because while the research itself is important, as one of our First Nations organisations partners said, it adds pressure on the organisation's time. So of the 35 significant urban areas, 30 significant urban areas are represented in the survey results. And First Nations organisations participated from Sydney region. There was 9 organisations, Coffs Harbour 4 organisations, Central Coast 3 organisations, Newcastle Maitland 2, Batemans Bay 2, Ulladulla 2, Barrel Mittagong 2, and there are other areas that were also represented. The organisations that participated were a mix of locally established community-controlled organisations, including 5 community-controlled health organisations, as well as local land councils, local native title bodies and regional Aboriginal legal services. So there was 41 community-controlled organisations altogether, and that other than native title bodies, which was 3, the Aboriginal Land Councils was 7, and the Regional Legal Service was 1. So over 40% of survey respondents were registered with the Offices of Register of Indigenous Corporations under the Corporations Act, and nearly 25% are respectively registered under the Corporations Act and the New South Wales Associations Incorporation Act, and nearly 10% are registered under the New South Wales Corporations Act. Cooperatives Act, sorry. So this is a really good breakdown of organisational representation as well. So given the verification purpose of the survey, testing the experience of our 9 First Nations discussion circle organisations more widely among urban First Nations organisations, and the rich qualitative data the survey generated, we believe it's accurate to assert that our findings are indicative of the experience and views of First Nations organisations in the state of New South Wales. So now what I'm going to do is turn to the results. So the survey asked respondents to indicate what the purpose aim of their organisation was, and we were thinking about this in the context of, whether organisations see themselves as service providers only, or whether they see themselves as having a greater purpose, aim and role in society. So we offered them with a range of options of different types of roles and aims and functions of their organisation. And so what we found was, so we gave them a predetermined survey delivery options like health services, housing, parenting programs, youth services, employment services, early intervention, out-of-home care, alongside other identified activities like language recovery, community representation, elder support, First Nations recognition, First Nations activism, cultural education, gathering place, cultural activities and community events. So what we found was, and I can't put the table up here because it's quite a large table, it takes up a whole paper, A4 paper, so I've tried to just break those down into groupings. But all 51 respondents chose several options, so everyone opted in for this question. And from the list, and this illustrates how they not only do more than service delivery, but organisations are multifunctional. And all respondents indicated that their organisations is engaged in broader activities that further the interests of First Nations peoples. For example, cultural activities, NAIDOC Week. 29 organisations are involved in cultural activities. 28 organisations are involved, do cultural education, cultural capabilities training is one example of that. 28 organisations are engaged in organising community events. 28 consider themselves a gathering place. 22 identify as engaged in community development. 21 identify as engaged in community representation. 20 identified as being engaged in First Nations recognition, and 19 identified as being engaged in First Nations activism, and 18 identified as being engaged in elders support. The response to this question showed that a single urban First Nations organisation often undertakes multiple societal functions, including advocacy, community development and service delivery, language revitalisation, caring for country and cultural resurgence, as well as several forms of service delivery. This could be as diverse as disability care, community housing, health services and even childcare. So what I did with the findings was to actually take 3 of the survey respondents and to do a snapshot of what those organisations do. So survey respondent 1, for example, that organisation identifies as a land council, but the respondent indicates that their organisation is engaged in providing community transport, cultural activities, cultural education, cultural heritage protection and site work, land and natural resource management, sporting and community activities, sponsoring community and sporting activities, i.e. the sponsoring the All Blacks, proof of Aboriginality, community representation, lobbying for community infrastructure, systemic advocacy, policy influence, advocating for individual people, sectoral policy development, First Nations recognition, reconciliation, community development and First Nations activism. Organisation 2, or survey respondent 2, identifies as a not-for-profit organisation registered with the Office of Registers Indigenous Corporations, with the founding objective of providing culturally appropriate health care services to First Nations peoples. And that respondent also indicates that their organisation is engaged in providing community transport, it's a gathering place, it's engaged in community events, men's groups, women's groups, elder support, cultural activities, has moms and bubs groups, health and wellbeing, including men's health, drug and alcohol services, proof of Aboriginality, systemic advocacy and policy influence, advocating for individual and community development. Organisation 3, or Survey Respondent 3, identifies as a not-for-profit and social enterprise registered as a New South Wales incorporated association with the founding objective of creating an organisation based in healing community and land, a niche market and a need in this area. And the respondent indicates that their organisation is a gathering place engaged in providing community events, men's groups, women's groups, cultural activities, cultural education, land and natural resource management, language recovery, training, family support, elder support, health and wellbeing, youth services, family and community healing, and community representation and creating community infrastructure. So what it shows is that organisations, their responses and responses from other organisations are multifunctional. And the qualitative open-ended responses also to a question about the original founding objectives of your organisation illustrate how urban First Nations organisations inhabit multiple economic, legal and political social spaces. So, I mean, I've just got an image of some of the work that the Glen does here, but so I've taken an extract from some of the responses to the open-ended qualitative answers around the original founding objective of the organisations. And here, as you can see by the 4 responses, one organisation's been established to both retain and strengthen the community, to achieve their individual and collective potential, providing service responses to address the disparity and disenfranchisement experienced across the health determinants, impeding self-determination and potential. Another organisation identifies that their founding purpose is our function in society is to service the community. Another organisation, through assisting First Nations people to resist the historical imbalance perpetuated by statutory child protection agencies, to foster self-determination that is written into the legislation currently not enacted in practice. Creating opportunities and driving the change across several areas of society through education, employment, enterprise, health and wellbeing. These experiences and opportunities will ensure the next generation will inherit much more. So one of the key themes emerging in the qualitative responses and answers is the idea of community, disparity and disenfranchisement, self-determination, and the idea of next generations and future generations, and the importance of supporting future generations. Reclaiming values, sharing, caring, respect. So here's another 3 organisations in terms of their original founding objective of their organisations. And I won't read them all out because, I mean, I'm trying to give you a sense of what these organisations, how they see themselves in terms of their role in society. So these responses give us some insight into the broader societal and economic returns that urban First Nations organisations provide through employment generation, increased labour force, participation and the promotion of Indigenous equality, and improved life outcomes for First Nations people through education, employment and enterprise, but also their key function, or what they see as their role in society. So one of the things that we looked at is the idea of beyond service delivery, and one of the things that we were looking at is how it related to the in-depth research that I had done in Newcastle around the function of organisations in urban areas around community development and self-determination. So the survey also contained a series of questions that identify the degree to which community development and self-determination factored in the establishment of First Nations organisations in urban localities. And so first the survey contained a question asking respondents to choose a development model that best reflects the model of their organisation at the time of establishment. And the purpose of this question was to establish whether the organisations were established for the purpose of service delivery only or had a broader community development agenda. And so, you know, for example, that is a process where community members come together to take collective action and generate solutions to common problems. Rather than simply asking if organisations were established to A, engage in service delivery, or B, community development, we identified a range of development agendas among the 9 First Nations discussion circle organisations, and use these to identify if there are any nuances in organisations' development models. So what you can see here is that we did find some nuances around that, and 27% of organisations identified that their organisations was established as a result of First Nations people coming together as a form of Indigenous activism to address the needs of First Nations peoples and communities in a specific locality. And they saw their relationship with the wider First Nations community in this locality as always being strong, and that they've been engaged with First Nations people in the development of our programs, initiatives, seeking information, opinions, as well as various leaders, elders and First Nations people in the development of our initiatives and programs, and that they'd created some great programs and issues along the way. And these programs were very responsive to the needs of the local First Nations peoples and communities in those localities. So 27% of organisations identified with that category of development or the development model. The second development model was that the organisation was established as a result of coming together as a form of Indigenous activism to engage in community economic development in a specific locality, and it had created local social infrastructure, including, so affordable housing, medical services, childcare services, and also creating jobs and opportunities for First Nations people. 8% of our survey respondents identified that that was their the development model at the time of establishment. 16% identified that the model was at the time of establishment was a small group of First Nations people who came together to address a pressing social problem experienced by First Nations peoples and communities, and involved a great deal of community engagement in terms of development of their organisations and their programs. 3% said that they were established by First Nations people to engage in community-driven development in terms of shifting the reliance on governments in terms of service delivery. So around, for example, housing, childcare, justice or disability services. 8% identified their organisation was established under national or state legislation, so it already had a clear mandate set at national or state level, and that would have been the land councils. 5% identified that their organisation was established by a small group of First Nations people to create a particular service, and that was created as a First Nations service delivery organisation only. And I'll come back to that point because even though that organisation, those organisations, two organisations identified that they were created for a service delivery only, how they see service delivery is very different within their qualitative responses as well to the current discourse around service provision. 3% of our organisations were established by a small group of First Nations people to create programs and service to advocate systemic change in relation to a particular social problem as it is experienced by First Nations people. And 14% were established by one or more First Nations people as a First Nations social enterprise, and that the initiative and programs we create provide both a market focus and to fulfil a social and cultural purpose. So over 90% of respondents to this question indicate that their organisation was not established for service delivery only, and that nearly 90% were established to address local agendas, engage with community to some degree. And that's 43 organisations. The other 8% indicate that their organisation has been established under national legislation, and of those, the results suggest that two main reasons why First Nations people come together to establish organisations in urban localities is to address the needs of First Nation peoples and communities in a specific locality, a pressing social problem experienced by First Nations peoples and communities. So, community is involved in the organisations established in the following ways. So organisations identified how communities were involved, and so our relationship with our relationship with the wider First Nations community in this locality has always been strong. We've engaged First Nations people in the development of our programs and issues, seeking information and opinions, as well as involving various leaders, elders and First Nations people in the development of initiatives. Either or community was involved in a great deal of community engagement in terms of development of our organisations and programs. So community features very importantly in the function of First Nations organisations, and we get to that a bit more in terms of the questions that we ask later in the survey. 6 organisations chose to give an open-ended response in terms of this question rather than check the boxes. And so examples I've got here on the screen to those open-ended questions were sort of still within the same framework of those other organisations, but they give a more specific reason why their organisation was created and a little bit more depth to our understanding of the background behind those organisations. So one organisation here was create access to country for caring responsibilities to share this knowledge with other people. Another organisation was a fairly small group of local Aboriginal people who got together, some employment happening around Lismore, not activists in the radical sense, but they were the people involved in getting community services going and improving a lot of youth and improving economic prospects at the local level. And they were involved in setting up that organisations. And while funding's restrictive, we are building better connections. Most of the work we do is once a person gets into the job. So that's sort of a bit of an insight into the development model of that organisation. So only 2 organisations identify that they were established to create a particular service and to be a First Nations service delivery organisation only. But these individual responses to the other questions, including their qualitative responses to a number of quantitative questions, illustrates how the notion of Indigenous service delivery is framed in relation to Indigenous practices, protocols and obligations. For example, survey respondent 52 identified that their organisation was established to deliver services to First Nations people, but in an open-ended response described their organisation's role as providing an alternative model to mainstream providers within a cultural framework. It supports the community perspective of how change can occur. And that same organisation indicated in its quantitative response that it considered the most important values of its organisation to be the following: that we engage with First Nations peoples holistically in terms of our history, culture and identity and its healing as First Nations people, and that we are organisations that First Nations peoples and the wider communities can trust, that provide a culturally safe space, that we are an inclusive organisation, that we respect First Nations peoples and communities we serve, and that we're an honest, open and transparent organisation, and that our organisation embodies a notion of First Nations power that is appropriate to First Nations culture, that we have a heart and compassion, that we make a difference in First Nations people's lives, and that we create pathways and hope for future generations. Again, while survey respondent 33 identified that their organisation was established for service provision only, the open-ended comments in response to this question illuminate how Indigenous societal obligations, ways of being and ways of knowing and doing, affect the way that your organisation operates in a service context. And I'm sure you've had a chance to read this, but we're an employment service. However, how we do business very much reflects our cultural values and ways of doing business. So the example here goes on to explain how the complex space that First Nations organisations navigate in the process of providing Indigenous service, Indigenous ways of being and ways of doing, including Indigenous protocols, are front and centre of organisational practices and providing an employment placement service. We also asked survey respondents to indicate all actions from a predefined list that best describes the establishment of their organisation. And the purpose of this question was not to only establish whether self-determination was a factor in the establishment of urban First Nation organisations, to find out what self-determination means to the organisation. So, I'll just come back. Oh, sorry, those slides were meant to correspond with what I was just saying. So ways organisations engage First Nations peoples and community in the development of their missions, aims and programs. And as we can see that First Nations peoples making, hang on, have I jumped ahead with one of my slides? Sorry, my slides seem to be out of order. So here we have First Nations peoples engaging in activities. Hang on, my slides seem to have got out of order. I'm just going to read from the page I've got here. So 72% of organisations said it's about First Nations people making decisions for themselves. 67% say that it's First Nations people determining their own futures. And 67% said that First Nations people engaging in the governance of their own social and cultural and economic futures. 60% identified that the actions that best describe their establishment or organisations was First Nations people engaging in activities that allow First Nations peoples to think for themselves and act in ways that shape their life trajectories and experiences. 60% identified that First Nations people controlling their own destiny was the reason behind the actions for establishing their organisations. 58% identified that First Nations people acting independently and exercising their free choice as agents bringing about social change for First Nations peoples. And we had, so what their responses, I'm sorry the slide that I've got up there doesn't correspond with the actual data I'm referring to, but over 80% of survey respondents answered this question. So 43 organisations that participated in the survey completed this response. And from the responses chosen, it's possible to assert that the main reason why urban First Nations people establish organisations is not about expressing First Nations power or even political power or even changing the social order, but it concerns the ability to engage in self-determination. That is, it's predominantly about First Nations people making decisions for themselves, 72%, First Nations people engaging in the governance of their own social and economic futures, 67%, and First Nations people determining their own futures and controlling their own destinies, 60%. Next, our survey response were asked to indicate what self-determination means in the context of their organisations, based on a predetermined list of indicators developed by a representative of 5 of the 6 partner organisations. Respondents were able to choose all indicators that apply to their organisation. And again, over 80% of survey respondents answered the quantitative component of this question, while nearly 65% of those responded to this question chose all 6 options, demonstrating the important place of self-determination to the way that their organisation operates. The majority, 81%, indicated that self-determination primarily relates to the capacity to make decisions appropriate for their organisation. Self-determination is also about having the autonomy to make decisions appropriate for the community they serve, 71%. It's about community defining an organisation's purpose, not funding agencies, 67%. And is about autonomy to design services and their delivery, 67%. It's about governing organisations based on First Nations values, 64%. 17% respondents provided a qualitative response only. And they identified that self-determination is the ability to make an informed decision without fear of reprisal, something we have to fight for constantly, respondent 8. Self-determination and leadership are paramount to success in conjunction with funding opportunities to build capacity, respondent number 22. And self-determination is about getting land back and then working with community to establish economic development that is ecologically and culturally friendly without the interference of local council and government DA processes, respondent 51. Community development and self-determination are clearly key reasons for establishing First Nations organisations. So in addition to understanding the degree to which First Nations organisations community development self-determination factor in the establishment of organisations, we set out to establish the possible identify an Indigenous organisational ontology amongst First Nation organisations, such as a common purpose, distinctive societal function, organisational values, distinctive societal obligations, including the way that First Nations organisations embed Indigenous culture into the practices of their organisations and engage First Nations people and communities in the development of their organisational practices and day-to-day operations. Representatives from our partner organisations developed the indicators for each question in this section of the survey. And survey respondents were asked to indicate how First Nations culture, values, principles and protocols and ways of being are incorporated into the way they do business. I'm not sure why my slides are out of sequence here. So I'm just going, here we are. So I just must have put one in the middle somehow. So here are our responses here. Of the 47 survey respondents who completed this question, 5 provided a qualitative answer, and nearly 90% indicated that First Nation culture underpins our organisation's philosophy and aims, so 89% or 42 respondents. And 87% or 41 respondents identified that programs are structured around First Nations principles and values and practices. 83% or 36 respondents, indicated that relevant community members and leaders are involved in the design of the programs. Over 70% indicated, or 36 organisations, or 77%, our programs reflect First Nations values and are responsive to First Nations ways of life. 77%, or 36 organisations, indicated that our governance structure embeds the principles of First Nations values, governance and societal obligations. Again, 77%, or 36 organisations, identify that elders are involved in the design of programs. 74%, or 35 respondents, identified that their organisation reinvigorates values, principles and other cultural elements in the contemporary political and economic reality. 70%, or 33 respondents, indicated that First Nations values are reflected in their organisational documents, and nearly 65% indicated that First Nations languages is or are used where possible in our programs and documents, so that's 30 organisations. Survey respondents were then asked to identify from a list of 9 values those that they consider to be most important values of their organisation, and 48 survey respondents answered this question. As this figure 4 indicates, 60% of respondents to this question chose all 9 values, and over 90% of respondents identify that the most important values of their organisation are creating pathways and hope for future generations, making a difference to First Nations people's lives, being an honest, open and transparent organisation, respecting the First Nations people they serve, providing a culturally safe place, and being an organisation that First Nations peoples and the wider communities can trust. The survey also included open-ended response to describe what their organisation's social purpose is in relation to First Nations peoples. So some of the ones that I've have up on the screen are some of the examples of the responses to this, and I'll let you read those out. But basically, I mean, it goes completely against the idea of a service delivery framework. Three responses illustrate how First Nations culture, values, principles, protocols and ways of being in the world are reflected in the way that organisations operate. Survey respondents were then asked in which of the following ways culture is embedded in the governance of their organisation, and they were given a list of 28 indicators of the potential ways that culture is embedded in the governance of their organisation and asked to identify those which apply to their governance of their organisation. So the indicators predominantly concern the organisation's engagement with community, alongside other cultural obligations as being core First Nations practices of governance. And 44 respondents answered this question. So I've got up on the screen some of the responses here, and it's the idea of a collective community focus in which our organisation thinks of itself in terms of its affiliation with local community organisations. We're accountable to the different groups and families in the local community. High value is placed on local elders and leaders and support for elders. We deliver services and outcomes that are promised to the community. We provide a flexible workspace to allow staff to fulfil cultural responsibilities. Our organisation operates in accordance with First Nations cultural values, practices and protocols and ways of doing business. We're respected in the local community. Our organisation employs First Nations staff with strong networks within and with the community. We celebrate NAIDOC Week and our other important cultural events. We're open, honest and fair in our dealing with leaders, elders, traditional owners and the wider community. High value is placed on our local community connections and support for community and good knowledge of the different cultural First Nations groups. So these indicators were developed by our First Nation partner organisations. So I'll just go through some of the other indicators that they identified: attachment to country, and there is a role for traditional owners in making decisions about how our organisation operates on country. We have a strong internal relationship and a clear idea of group and kinship members of First Nations people accessing our organisation, its programs and services. We don't impose change. Our governance have cultural legitimacy. Our corporation's rulebooks embeds First Nations culture and governance practice into our corporation. Mutual responsibility between our organisations and First Nations people. We report back. Our board and management are constantly speaking out in the community, speaking with First Nations people. Our leaders, we keep leaders, elders and community informed, and the community are voting members of our organisations. Our mandate is not community-driven, but issue-driven from a First Nations perspective. We have community forums that inform the directions and decisions of our board. We keep leaders, elders and community informed about funding and our capacity to deliver in terms of meeting our community identified needs. And our organisation reflects the governance history of this locality. Our board and leaders are chosen in a way that reflects the governance history of this locality. So these indicators that show that nearly 90% of organisations consider that they have a good knowledge of the different cultural First Nations groups in their community. A high value is placed on local community connections and support community. This extends to being open, honest and fair in their dealings with their leaders, elders, traditional owners and the wider community, and celebrating NAIDOC Week and other important cultural events. Survey respondents were then asked, in what ways do your organisation engage with First Nations peoples and community in the development of your mission, programs and 44 of the 51 organisations responded to this question. So as you can see here, 3/4 of those who answered this question indicated that elders, leaders and community members are being involved in the design of their organisation and development of its mission, aims from the beginning. Their organisation consults regularly with elders and traditional owners for advice. They have an open door policy where local First Nations people walk in and yarn with them about their experience and needs that they respond to those walk-ins. A community of formal members of their organisation. So we also asked them to briefly describe First Nations governance as it applies to their organisation. And here's one, I've just included a few of the responses here. I know that we're running out of time, so here's some of the responses, and I'll just quickly jump to some of the other shorter responses. So Aboriginal governance for our organisation is utilising Aboriginal being, knowing and doing and formalising this within our structures, encompasses how we care for country, arrange ceremony, manage and share resources and pass on cultural knowledge. We listen to our community, our decisions making is based on views while ensuring the rights of all individuals are respected. Best interests of individuals in regard to their rights for equality and justice is to act in the best interests of the community. And within the organisation, both law and law are considered from a organisation perspective. First Nations law and law is foremost, but not cultural. Sorry, I've lost my place. Respected and applied to meet legislative requirements ensures business is both financially and socially viable. So coming back to the discussion about I'm sorry I've rushed through it and there's quite a lot to digest in there. Coming back to the reversing the ontological lens. What the data does is, the survey data, it illuminates ways in which Indigenous governance and new public management ontologies are in conflict. An Indigenous organisational ontology is based on a set of cultural and social values that guide how First Nations organisations do business. And these values include obligations to community and the goals of self-determination and collective recovery, well-being and governance. First Nations organisations place culture, healing, true lived experiences, deep community connections and self-determination at the centre of all we do. And the agenda is to drive change across society, employment, enterprise, education, health and well-being. So importantly, urban First Nations organisations participate in the survey, whether they were established in the 1970s or the 2010s, indicate that the quantitative and qualitative data, that their core societal function of their organisation centres around community and self-determination. And even in the new public management era, community-based organisations remain multifunctional organisations serving community as a means and mechanism through which those First Nations people achieve a form of self-determination. And critically too, the qualitative data reveals that external societal contexts shape the social and cultural structures of urban First Nations organisations. The data reveals that the central function of community and cultural values and practices to the way organisations operate in the different societal spaces that they inhabit. And in these spaces, they not only involve community in their programs and in governance of organisations, but they give a voice to community. They occupy and operate in these spaces to be a voice for their needs and to be a voice for the most vulnerable people in community. And that's just some of the extracts also from the survey as well. So there is a set of Indigenous cultural and societal values that underpin the way organisations operate. And that is, they operate primarily around their obligations to community and self-determination, and in relation to collective recovery, well-being and governance. So I'll just end it there, and just to do a quick plug for our deep listening workshop, which provides more overview of the findings of this research. This is just a snapshot into one of the papers and some of the data that we've produced from the research. So next Thursday, July 22nd from 2:30 to 4:30, and then Friday from 8:30 to 12:30. We've got a bit of a break in between. So we'll be presenting a paper on the Great Divides, conflicting Indigenous state ontologies in the Indigenous service market, Karen, Janet and I, and then our organisation case study presentations on their experiences in relation to the research. And then on the Friday morning, we'll have presentations from Canada. Some of the organisations we'll be looking at from self-determination to service delivery, and one of the urban Indigenous strategies from the city of Hamilton in Canada. And then Capo Maori, Chrissy Cowan will be talking about the disability sector, and Charlotte Moore will be talking about the imposition of state-determined structures of governance and regulation on Maori organisations. And then we'll be having a discussion of reconfiguring and reimagining new public management discussion circle after that from 11 to 12:30. So I'll just end there and then stop sharing my screen and open up for questions. I'm so sorry it was so rushed and so condensed.
Thanks so much, Deirdre, for that really fascinating piece of work. There was a lot there to digest. Now we're happy to take questions by the chat or by video. I will stop the recording, so your questions will be just ephemeral rather than on the Zoom record.